Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island, and today we're talking about the psychological aspects of horror fiction. Now keep in mind that the notion of psychological horror is really self-referential, because horror in itself, being an emotion, is based on the psychology of human beings. What makes something horrific or terrifying or just simply scary has everything to do with the way that an image or a storyline or a plot device impacts the reader. When we use the term psychological horror, however, what we're really focusing on is horror that is not rooted in the grotesque and the obvious, like you would get in a slasher film or something like that, or even the psychological aspects of something being graphically described, such as some kind of assault or something like that, as much as it is about the notion that the protagonist, and by proxy the reader, is going to experience a tension and a terror based more on the unknown and the suspense aspects, even if there is not very much clarity as to what is supposed to be frightening. This actually has roots in the original horror fiction, including early works like The Monk, in which the notion of horror was based on two elements. Primarily, one of them is the idea that righteous people, especially those in the religious business, who are going to transgress those rules, in some ways are beyond the pale in terms of our understanding as to how they could do such a thing. And certainly Lewis's depiction of this monk doing all these unspeakable things, some of them rather mild by modern standards, but the deal is that the reader is kind of horrified at the notion that someone of such great standing could do these things. Not that humans could do them, but actually somebody who we would expect to be above those things because of their religious and social position. Later on, of course, we get the work from Mary Shelley, who is, in her story Frankenstein, is examining in some levels some of those same religious ideas as to playing God and what's right and wrong and what humans have the right or to do or not do. But remember that the story is not only told in this epistolary fashion through these letters and things from the various people in the story, but also from the creature himself. And a lot of the horror of the story is the pathos that is embodied in the creature, when we realize the creature's behavior is rooted in his suffering of being rejected by his creator. And we have a mixture of things going on here where we're not really focusing so much on the specific details of the horrific, of the grotesque aspects of his makeup and of what he looks like and even the things that he's doing, but rather the torture that the creature is suffering because he has been rejected and because his creator has refused to give him someone to love. And everything that happens to Victor Frankenstein and the people around him at the hands of the creature are clearly because the creature is getting revenge for not being treated well. And we really get into this notion that Shelley is examining what happens to an individual when they are rejected by society, when they're rejected by their family, and certainly these things would come to be part of Freud's analysis later on when he talks about the adult being a result of that child's relationship with his or her parents, especially the mother. Certainly, Edgar Allan Poe took it to a new level by taking religion completely, or almost completely, out of the equation and focusing specifically on the psychological aspects of horror, and certainly the psychological aspects of the human being and how that lends itself to horror. And in many cases, we are not seeing the actual event. We don't see the death of Lenore in The Raven. We don't see the death of Helen. We don't see the losses that the characters have as much as we see the aftermath. And what he's focusing on are the psychological effects of these things. The story told by the narrator in certainly The Black Cat and also in The Telltale Heart is this tale that basically is told from a person who is suffering a psychological breakdown, but who in their discussion seems entirely rational to themselves. And what Poe is examining here is the psychological breakdown of somebody who perceives the world and their own actions in a very specific way that forces us to ask ourselves about the meaning of reality and how it is relative to every individual person. And certainly his use of Freudian psychology to examine these characters, certainly taking away from that religious aspect, is an important development of that psychological horror. And a lot of his works, like many of the other authors, they're not very graphic when it really gets down to it. Instead, he is analyzing and developing the notion of the psychological impact on the character, and of course, and that is having a similar effect on the reader. When we get to later material by somebody like Lovecraft, one of Lovecraft's conceits was that the character is going to investigate something, and then they find either a creature or an event or something from outer space or whatever that is so horrific that it's not even described. Instead, the author is writing about, very often in first-person narrative, is writing about the impact on the character rather than what they are actually perceiving. And this lack of specificity sometimes is helpful because it allows the reader to fill in their most frightening thing. One director of early horror movies pointed out that once you create the creature, you have solidified what the thing is, and therefore the audience may or may not find what is being portrayed as frightening. But if you just simply create a reaction for the character and show that they're horrified, the audience is far more likely to fill in that blank as to what the thing is that frightens them the most, and now everybody is feeling the horror, even though the actual creature, the actual thing that is supposed to be so frightening, has not been clearly identified. Certainly when we get to later years and we get to perhaps more modern and more contemporary works, and for most of us, Alfred Hitchcock would not necessarily fall into contemporary works, but his method of creating what is considered certainly a new wave of horror fiction was a mixture of the graphic, but also especially a study in the effects of psychology on individuals. And whether we're talking about Vertigo or we're talking about Rear Window, in which there is a lot of mystery involved into what is actually happening, and we get the notion that Hitchcock is examining the psychology of the character rather than focusing on the graphic aspect of it. Certainly one of his most famous movies, Psycho, focuses on this attack on Janet Leigh in the shower, but of course by today's standards we see no actual physical puncturing of any body parts by the knife. We don't see any nudity. Everything is all real quick cut, and a lot of it is hinted, and then you see the chocolate syrup swirling down the drain, and we fill in the blanks. The rest of the movie is about examining the relationship between the detective and certainly the Janet Leigh's character's sister, trying to figure out what's going on and examining the character of Anthony Perkins. And of course, the real surprise at the end of the story is not that this guy killed this woman, but that this guy has actually been living this duality in which he is reenacting his mother in this thing, and it becomes a real psychological aspect in terms of we're focusing more on the psyche and more on the character's mind and emotional state rather than focusing on the graphic aspects of terror, of a true monster outside of the human being, of a true threat outside of the human being, and very often there's not even a true threat of a human being, of another human being outside of the individual. These things are clearly inside, and that's where psychological horror really focuses. It's about the character struggling with something that is more internal than it is external. And when we talk about psychological horror and you're looking for something that falls within that context, especially something you're going to apply a psychoanalytical criticism to, you're looking for a character that is essentially battling themselves and putting up some kind of front. And then that front is revealed to be phony by the end of the work. And of course, the use of this by authors is pretty consistently designed to not only have this sort of surprise at the end of the story, although when you look back at it, you realize you could see some of these things coming, but also is predicated on the understanding that the reader, the viewer, whatever, understands the way that psychoanalytical perspectives work and the way that psychology works. So when that character is denying that there is a wolf man, and they're denying that there is that kind of stuff, and then at the end of the story we find out that the character is the wolf man, the author was creating this whole thing on purpose to talk about the way that human beings try to live in denial of their deepest, darkest urges, and it all comes back to that aspect of that Freudian psychology. And certainly whether we're talking about the early material that preceded Freud, that talked about the devil inside the person that created the evil, or we're talking a more modern perspective in which we're talking about the psychological defects of an individual who has been damaged either by genetics or by experience. The psychological thriller, the psychological horror, is still a pretty strong element in both film and in story, in fiction, in print. And you should be looking for that as an aspect of the fiction that you read or observe. All right. Have a great day and stay in touch.